I'd like to begin by echoing the thanks that some of my co-panelists have offered to Churchill College, to all of those who've organized this conference. I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of this and have enjoyed being part of these discussions the last couple of days. My task here is to provide a comparative perspective and also to move the discussion into the present, the contemporary era, to look at what role religion plays in American democracy today. And I begin by saying, we have to be cautious whenever we're offering comparisons between Britain and the United States or between any two societies, that we don't engage in caricature, that we don't destroy nuance or simplification in the interest of oversimplification in trying to draw too sharp a distinction. It was interesting, as I was talking to a friend of mine before I came here, telling him that I was coming to this conference, and he said, "Oh, so what's the conference about?" And I said, "Oh, well, it's a conference where we're going to be talking a lot about religion in British public life." And his response was, "That should take about 10 minutes," which reflects the perception on the part of many Americans that Britain is a dramatically more secular society, almost a universally secular society, compared to the United States. And of course, there's a kernel of truth there. In the same sense, though, that's an overstatement. So, too, is the perception that sometimes exists in Britain and elsewhere in Europe that the United States is just teeming with wild-eyed Christian fundamentalists who dominate American social and political life. This is likewise a caricature. So, I will say, however, that like most stereotypes, they are rooted in a kernel of truth. Right? They are exaggerations of what are some real patterns that can point to some definite differences between our two societies. And so I will begin illustrating the role that religion plays in American democracy today, but with keeping in mind that I don't want to exaggerate or caricature or destroy nuance in the distinctions that I'm talking about between American and British society. So it's important, first of all, that we recognize the constitutional context in which religion plays out in the United States. And for those who are not familiar, this is set by the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, the relevant portion of which says, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." So there are two key guarantees there. There's both the guarantee of non-establishment and the guarantee of free exercise. And they are equally important, and they are sometimes in tension with one another. And in fact, the tension that can exist between those two equally important guarantees is really at the crux of the debates that exist in American society about the proper interactions of church and state. And I would argue that in different ways, both of these guarantees serve to differentiate the relationships between religion and public life that exist in America from the relationships that prevail at various places in Europe. So just as the non-establishment guarantee clearly differentiates the United States from Britain in the sense that we have no established church, so the free exercise guarantee differentiates the United States from France, where there are much greater protections for religious expression in America than what we would find in France. So in the same way, for example, that the Italian practice of having crucifixes in public school classrooms would never be acceptable in the United States because of the non-establishment guarantee, so too the French ban on wearing a crucifix necklace for an individual would be equally unimaginable in the United States because of the free exercise guarantee. So this is the constitutional context, and the two, I won't say competing, but the two imperatives that are in some tension and the negotiation of which set the contours for religion and public life in America. So who are the people, then, that act within this constitutional landscape with regard to religion? Well, we begin by pointing out that about 80% of the U.S. population identifies as Christian in response to surveys. Now, and these are Christians of various types. Here we're talking about mainline Protestants, evangelical Protestants, Roman Catholics. A small portion of this is actually Mormon. I'm not going to get into debates over whether they should be properly classified as Christian or not. That's a sideshow here. But the point is that it's about 4 out of every 5 Americans take some identifiably Christian label. Likewise, 16% of Americans report that they have no religious identification. Now, I would advise some caution with regard to both of these figures, because as a representative, I believe yesterday, from the Secularist Society pointed out, not everyone who takes the label Christian in a survey is actually deeply committed in any theological sense to Christianity. That is certainly true. Many of those 80% are not especially religiously observant. Many of them have a sort of residual cultural Christianity and may take that label as a badge of identification with that, but certainly would not see Christianity influence their daily life in any profound way. It's also worth pointing out, though, that there's a similar phenomenon with regard to these people who report no religious affiliation, that many of them are actually not atheists or agnostics. In fact, what's interesting in the data is that of those people who report no religious affiliation, 37% say that they regard the Bible as either the literal or the inspired Word of God. Okay? 35% report that they pray with some regularity. Now, what we're talking about here, for many of these people, are those who are uncomfortable identifying with any institutional religious body, but who themselves do retain some religious ethos, or for whom religion, on a very personalized way, plays some role in their lives. So both the Christian and the no religious identification categories do need to be viewed with some caution, because, of course, there's an infinite variety of human permutations when it comes to spiritual matters, and it's hard to reduce them to a few broad categories. What we do see behaviorally is that in the United States, approximately 40% of Americans attend religious services regularly. And so what that means is that while religious commitment and religious observance in the United States is not overwhelming, it is certainly higher than exists in most European countries. And I think this figure is roughly 5 times the percentage that we see in the United Kingdom, or at least 4 to 5 times what the figures would be in the UK in terms of regular attendance at religious services. So what characterizes then American public attitudes when it comes to the role of religion in public life? And here I draw on some survey data that were compiled by the Pew Charitable Trusts, looking at Americans' attitudes towards accommodation of religion in the public sphere. A couple of things that I think are illustrative. First of all, 70% of Americans report that they support the posting of the 10 Commandments in public buildings. 65% support voluntary prayer in public schools. 66% support government funding of faith-based charitable initiatives. These would be community projects run by churches, synagogues, mosques that fight drug abuse or poverty or whatever it may be, and that joint ventures of this sort were first permitted under President Bush, and President Obama has continued that policy. What this shows is that in the American public, at least, that there's a broad-based rejection of the wall of separation idea, the idea that there has to be this rigid, firm barrier between the sacred and the secular. Most Americans are not on board with that. Clearly, large majorities are willing to see some accommodation of religion in public life, including large numbers of people who are not themselves particularly religious. I mean, as you will see, these numbers greatly exceed the percentage of Americans who attend religious services regularly. So we have large numbers of Americans who are not themselves especially observant, but who like the idea that there should be some acknowledgments of religion in public life. So this idea of a wall of separation is not accurately descriptive of the way that most Americans understand the proper relationship between church and state. It's also very important to point out that the phrase wall of separation is not in the U.S. Constitution. It's kicked around a lot by constitutional law scholars, and particularly people of a particularly secularist bent. But that phrase comes from Thomas Jefferson, who was actually not present at the Constitutional Convention. He was U.S. ambassador to France at the time, had various reservations with aspects of the Constitution, had his own interpretations of it, was himself certainly of very much a secular bent, but it suggests a much more impermeable barrier between the religious and public spheres than most Americans seem to desire, certainly on the basis of these data. At the same time, Americans clearly do not desire sectarianism. That is, there is no support, essentially none, in America for the idea of declaring a particular denomination to be the official national religion, or for singling out a particular religious tradition for preferment over others. Most Americans, the data consistently indicate, would like to see a broad-based governmental acknowledgement and support for the role of religion in public life, but not narrowly tailored to favor one particular religious tradition. Okay, so let's talk about some of the effects of religion on contemporary American democracy. First of all, we see very clearly that there are effects on elections, that religion matters when it comes to voting in the United States. Religious commitment, in fact, has become the central predictor of partisan attachments among white Americans. This has not always been so. As recently as the 1970s, a person's level of religious commitment told us essentially nothing about whether he or she was more likely to be a Democrat or a Republican. That began to change in the 1980s, and it has become progressively more and more dramatic over time, such that now, as we see in 2012, 72% of religiously committed white Americans, that is, those who report that they attend religious services every week or almost every week, 72% of religiously committed whites supported Mitt Romney. Only 35% of secular whites supported Mitt Romney. Okay, and by secular here, I'm defining that as those people who say they attend religious services seldom or never. The people who fall between those groups, not surprisingly, fall between those percentage numbers. So if we compare the religiously committed to the secular, that's a huge gap of 37 percentage points in the likelihood of voting for the Republican presidential candidate. And this God gap dwarfs the gaps that exist on the basis of gender and income. We hear a lot in the media about the gender gap, about how women are more likely to be Democrats than men. This is true. The gender gap varies depending on the election, anywhere from 4 to 10 percentage points. But the difference between men and women, therefore, is dramatically smaller than the difference in partisan attachments between the religiously committed and the secular. Likewise, the gaps on the basis of income and social class, which used to be very, very powerful predictors of whether someone in the United States would be a Republican or a Democrat, they're still there, but they've become less important over time as the difference, according to religious commitment, has increased. The big exception to this pattern would be racial minorities. African Americans are, in fact, the most religious group of Americans. African Americans are the most religiously observant sector of American society, and yet they remain overwhelmingly Democratic. Even before Barack Obama was on the ticket, African Americans typically gave Democratic candidates 90% of their vote in presidential elections. That increased to 95% when President Obama became the Democratic candidate. So despite very, very strong religious commitment, African Americans are an exception here. Okay, so those are the effects on elections. Let's talk some about the effects on civil society. And I must say I draw here on a great book called Pews, Prayers, and Participation that was written by Corwin Schmidt, Douglas Koopman et al., some faculty at Calvin College in Michigan, where they did extensive analysis of all sorts of data about the relationship between religion and various indicators of social capital, civic participation, et cetera. And they have some important findings that I want to just quickly highlight. First of all, religiously committed people in America are more politically engaged. They are more likely than secular Americans to vote. They're more likely to participate in campaign activities. They're in pretty much any measure of political participation that you choose to use, religious affiliation is positively associated with political engagement. Secondly, religious commitment in America is strongly associated with participation in secular civic associations. Okay? What I'm talking about here is, for example, being part of a neighborhood association, being part of a parent-teacher organization at a child's school, volunteering with the Boy Scouts or some other such organization. Participation in all of those secular organizations of civil society is higher among those who are religiously committed than it is among more secular Americans. In addition, religiously committed Americans give more than twice as much to charity as a percentage of their income as compared to secular Americans. Importantly, this is not simply a function of their giving to their own churches. I mean, that's a part of this, right? They score higher because they give money to their own churches. But even if we look simply at giving to non-religious charitable institutions, religiously committed Americans, on average, give a bit more of their income to secular charitable institutions than do secular Americans. So we're talking here about, the symphony, an art museum, a university, something of that sort. Religiously committed Americans are more likely to contribute. Those would, I think, all be regarded as positive features of religion. On the more troubling side, it is also true that religiously committed Americans are somewhat less politically tolerant. And this is measured by the percentage who say that they support the right of people like communists and atheists and Islamists and others to give public speeches, to have their books in public libraries. Religiously committed Americans are somewhat more likely than secular Americans to object to those freedoms of political speech and political discourse for those with whom they disagree. Am I about out of time, or do I have a couple minutes? Okay, I'll wrap it up here. So, what we see then is, and this was, Religion in American Politics Today, the Whirlwind Tour in 15 minutes. but what we see is that the American public seeks an accommodationist attitude towards religion. They reject both the idea of establishment or preferment for one particular religious tradition, and also the idea of a rigid secularism, or what the French would call laïcité. Neither of those is a model that's embraced by the American public. Secondly, religion permeates both American electoral behavior as well as the institutions of American civil society in ways that I think are, the data suggest, predominantly but not exclusively positive. I think that's the best summation of the role that religion plays in contemporary American democratic life. And I will leave it at that, and we can have questions.